The air at the Henderson estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late summer dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the bittersweet smell of a life's work being sold off piece by piece. It was September of 1972. For most farmers in Black Hawk County, Iowa, it was a time of dizzying optimism. Corn was pushing $3 a bushel, and the talk at the co-op was of nothing but expansion. For Thomas Miller, it was just another Saturday. He stood near the back of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim overalls, his knuckles stained with the ghosts of grease and oil that no amount of lava soap could ever fully erase. His eyes, the color of a faded blue work shirt, scanned the line of machinery. They weren't looking at the gleaming, barely used John Deere 4430 that was drawing all the attention. They were fixed on something older, something most of the younger crowd had already dismissed. It was a John Deere 7700 combine, the first generation with the turbo engine. This one had seen its share of harvests. The green paint was faded to a pale lime on the top of the grain tank, and rust was starting to bubble around the wheel wells. But Tom saw past that. He saw the straightness of the frame, the lack of major welds on the feeder house, the way the sheet metal, though weathered, wasn't beaten to hell. He knew this machine. Old man Henderson had been as meticulous as they come. A slap on the back nearly sent him stumbling. "Well, I'll be damned, Miller. You here to buy the scrap pile?" Tom didn't need to turn around. The voice was as slick and loud as the man it belonged to. Richard Harrison. Rich, as everyone called him, and for good reason. He'd inherited a decent spread just like Tom, but that's where the similarities ended. While Tom was still running his father's John Deere 4020 and a Farmall M for odd jobs, Rich had already traded up twice. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now, most of it rented, all of it financed. Tom turned slowly. "Afternoon, Rich. Just lookin'." Rich grinned, a flash of white teeth under a perfectly trimmed mustache. He was wearing a brand-new seed corn cap, a crisp western shirt, and boots that looked like they'd never seen the inside of a hog pen. He gestured with his thumb toward the shiny 4430. "That's what you ought to be looking at. Got to spend money to make money, Tom. This ain't your daddy's world no more. Secretary of Agriculture Butts himself said get big or get out." He said it like he'd invented the phrase. A few of the other farmers nearby nodded in agreement, their eyes lingering on Rich's new silver Ford F-250 Ranger parked near the lane. Tom just gave a slight nod. "She's a nice tractor, all right." "Nice? Hell, it's the future," Rich boomed. "I'm going to pick that thing up, and then I'm buying that new 8-row planter to go with it. Plant fence row to fence row. You can't do that with that old 6-row junk you're pulling." The auctioneer's patter picked up as they moved down the line. Tom ignored him. He walked over to the old 7700, the crowd parting around him as they migrated toward the newer iron. He ran a hand over a tire. Good tread, but showing some weather checking. He climbed the ladder, the metal groaning under his weight. In the cab, the seat cushion was split, yellow foam peeking through. The air conditioning belt was missing, and the glass was hazy with a film of dust that had been there for years. But the hour meter read 3,100 hours. Low for a machine its age, he knew Henderson had only farmed a quarter section with it. It was barely broken in. He heard Rich laughing with his cronies. Look at him, probably trying to figure out if his wrenches will even fit the bolts on that relic. Tom ignored them. He climbed down, knelt, and ran his hand along the underside of the final drive, feeling for leaks. It was bone dry. He checked the wobble box on the grain head, giving it a good shake. Solid. The augers had some wear, but they had another 5 seasons in them, maybe more if he ran them slow. This was a good machine, a simple machine. No complex electronics, no computer boards, just steel, diesel, and hydraulics. Things a man could understand, things a man could fix himself on a Sunday morning with a toolbox and a pot of coffee. The bidding started on the 4430. It was fast and furious. Rich jumped in with a swagger, his voice loud, making sure everyone knew who was setting the pace. Tom didn't even watch. He was already calculating in his head what he could get for his old John Deere 6601 pull-type combine, what he could afford to spend on this 7700, and how much he'd have left for an overhaul. He never bought a piece of used equipment without tearing it down first. It was the only way to know what you really had. Rich won the tractor for a price that made a few old-timers whistle under their breath. He paid with a check from a bank Tom had never even heard of, a big city agricultural lender. Then he bought the planter and a new disc and a field cultivator, all of them big, all of them shiny, all of them bought with the flourish of a man who believed his signature was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Finally, the auctioneer got to the 7700. "All right, boys, what have we got here? A classic John Deere combine. A bit of rust, but she runs like a top. Who'll start me at $5,000? Silence. Crickets chirped in the long grass along the fence line. 5,000? Come on now, the engine alone is worth that. How about $4,000 for a working combine? More silence. The other farmers were already drifting toward their pickups, talking about Rich's bold moves. 3,000. I got 3,000 from anyone? Tom raised a single finger. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I got 3,000 from Tom Miller. Now we're moving. Who'll give me 3,100? No one. The crowd was already gone. Rich was standing by his truck, shaking hands, accepting congratulations like he'd just won an election. 3,100? 3,100 anywhere, the auctioneer pleaded. Sold, for $3,000 to Tom Miller. As Tom walked toward the auctioneer's trailer to settle up, paying with a check drawn on his modest account at the Black Hawk County Savings and Loan, he passed Rich. Rich shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. $3,000 for that heap. You could have put that down on a real machine, Tom. A real one. Instead, you're just buying yourself a winter's worth of work and a summer's worth of breakdowns. Tom just looked him in the eye. I like to know what I'm running, Rich, and I like to own what I'm running. Rich laughed out loud. Own it. You'll own it all right. You'll own every busted bearing and every plugged sieve. Me? I'll be in an air-conditioned cab listening to the radio while the bank owns my machine. And you know what? The bank doesn't call you at 2 in the morning when a hydraulic line blows. The dealer does. That's progress, my friend. He clapped Tom on the shoulder again, a gesture that was more condescending than friendly, and walked away, the king of the auction. Tom watched him go. He saw the other farmers looking at him, some with pity, some with a kind of second-hand embarrassment. He was the relic, just like the combine he'd just bought. A holdover from a bygone era. Driving his old Chevy C50 grain truck home, the late afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windshield, Tom thought about what Rich had said. About progress, about banks and dealers and getting big. Maybe he was right. Maybe the world was changing faster than he was. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Rich Harrison? The kind of fella who measures his own worth by the shine on his chrome and the size of his banknote. The guy who talks big at the coffee shop and makes you feel small for being careful. Let me know down in the comments, because I've got a feeling every small town in America has at least one. The next Monday, Tom had the 7700 hauled to his farm. It looked even older and more tired sitting in his machine shed next to the familiar shape of his 4020. His shed wasn't fancy. It was a pole building his father and he had put up 15 years prior, with a gravel floor and a single string of bare bulbs for light. But in the back corner was his shop. It was the heart of the entire operation. A heavy steel workbench was bolted to the wall, a massive vise at one end. Tools hung in orderly ranks on a pegboard, wrenches sorted by size, sockets in their trays, hammers and pry bars with handles worn smooth by his father's hands and his own. In the corner stood a heavy-duty drill press and a Lincoln arc welder that had stitched more broken steel back together than he could count. The air in the shop always smelled the same, a mix of cold steel, cutting oil, and the faint, sharp scent of gasoline from his parts washing tank. For the next 3 months, that shop was where Tom lived. He didn't start by trying to fire up the combine. He started with pressure washing. He spent 2 full days blasting away a decade of caked-on grease, chaff and dirt, revealing the machine's bones. He worked methodically from front to back. He pulled the grain head into the shop first, setting it on heavy-duty stands. He took the sickle bar completely apart, inspecting every guard and knife section. He replaced a dozen of them, sharpening the rest on his bench grinder, the shower of orange sparks lighting up his focused face. He checked the wobble box, draining the thick, dark gear oil and refilling it. He found a bearing in one of the reel arms that felt gritty when he turned it by hand. It would have lasted another season, maybe. But that wasn't how Tom did things. He spent half a day with a puller and a torch, getting the old bearing race out and pressing a new one in. It was slow, frustrating work. While he worked, the sounds from across the road were a constant reminder of Rich Harrison's progress. The powerful roar of that new 4430 echoed across the valley as Rich worked deep into the fall, ploughing under his corn stalks with a new 5-bottom moldboard plough. Tom would pause, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand, and listen. It was a good-sounding engine, he had to admit. Smooth and strong, but it was the sound of debt. Every hour that tractor ran, the meter was ticking, not just on the engine, but on the bank loan. The talk at the diner in town was all about Rich, how many acres he'd ploughed in a day. The rumor that he was already in talks to buy the 80 acres south of his place when old man Peterson retired. No one talked about Tom Miller except maybe to shake their heads. Saw Tom's new combine, one farmer might say to another over coffee. Looks like he pulled it out of a junkyard. Poor fella's gonna miss half the harvest next year fooling with that thing. Tom heard the whispers. He felt the sideways glances when he went to the parts store. The counterman, a young kid named Dave, always seemed to have a smirk on his face when Tom would come in asking for a bearing number for a machine that was already 10 years old. "Still working on that old girl, Tom?" he'd ask. Rich Harrison was in here yesterday, ordered a whole pallet of filters for his new stuff. Said he wants to do all his maintenance on schedule so he doesn't have to worry about it. One afternoon, a universal joint on the main drive shaft for the separator gave Tom fits. It was seized with rust. He soaked it in penetrating oil, heated it with his torch until it glowed cherry red, and beat on it with a 3-pound sledgehammer until his arms ached and the shop was filled with a blue haze. It wouldn't budge. He was tired, frustrated, and for a moment Rich's words echoed in his head. "You're just buying yourself a winter's worth of work." He threw the hammer down, and it clanged against the concrete floor. He sat on an overturned bucket, the silence of the shop pressing in on him. Outside, the wind howled, a precursor to the winter to come. He could just call the dealer, have them order a whole new shaft. It would cost a few $100s, money he'd rather spend on seed. But it would be easy. It would be the new way. He sat there for a long time, looking at the stubborn piece of steel. He thought of his father, a man who could make anything run with baling wire and ingenuity. His father had paid off this farm during the Depression, a time when neighbors were losing everything. He did it by being careful, by fixing what was broken instead of buying what was new. He'd taught Tom that sweat was a form of capital, and a man who could fix his own equipment was a man who could control his own destiny. Tom stood up, picked up the torch again, and went back to work. This time he heated it slower, more deliberately, tapping around the edges of the U-joint cap, working it patiently. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, it broke free. He pumped a fist in the air, a small, solitary victory in the quiet of his shed. He didn't just save a few $100s, he had reaffirmed who he was. By the time the first real snow fell in December, he had the grain head and the feeder house completely rebuilt. He'd moved on to the engine, a John Deere 6404T diesel. He gave it a full tune-up, new injectors, new filters, adjusted the valves and changed the oil. He fired it up one cold afternoon. The engine turned over slow at first, then caught with a belch of black smoke that quickly cleared. It settled into a low, rumbling idle, a steady, dependable rhythm that was music to his ears. He spent the rest of the winter going through the rest of the machine. He replaced chains and sprockets, patched a small hole in the grain tank, and rewired the lights. He found the source of the missing AC belt, a seized compressor clutch. He took it apart on his workbench, found a replacement bearing at a specialty shop in Waterloo, and put it all back together. By March, when the snow was beginning to melt, the John Deere 7700 didn't look much different on the outside. But inside, Tom knew it was a new machine, and he knew every single bolt and wire on it. The early 1970s were a golden age for American agriculture, or so it seemed. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union in 72 and 73 sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Land values, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly exploded. A farmer's net worth could double on paper in a single year without him planting a single extra seed. It was a heady, intoxicating time, and no one was more intoxicated than Rich Harrison. The high prices and soaring land values were like gasoline on the fire of his ambition. With his farm's value on the bank's books doubling, his borrowing power doubled right along with it. He bought the Peterson 80, then the 160 acres from the widow Jensen. Before anyone knew it, Rich was farming a contiguous block of over 3,000 acres. He was the biggest operator in the county under the age of 50. His iron got bigger too. The 4430 was joined by a brand new International Harvester 1466, a beast of a tractor with its gleaming red paint, white cab, and the throaty roar of its turbo diesel. He bought a new Gleaner L2 combine, a silver behemoth that could chew through 8 rows of corn at a time. His farmstead started to look like a dealer's lot. New grain bins, gleaming silver, sprouted up like mushrooms after a spring rain. He built a new heated machine shed with a concrete floor and fluorescent lights, so big you could park a semi-truck in it. The community saw him as a titan, a visionary. At the co-op, farmers would stop talking when he walked in, eager to hear what he had to say about the markets or the new chemicals. He was featured in an article in the Waterloo Courier, a picture of him standing in front of his new combine, arms crossed, the very picture of the modern, successful farmer. The article quoted him extensively. "You can't be timid," he'd said. "In this business, you go big or you go home. The guys who are still trying to farm like their granddaddies did, they're going to be the first ones to go under when things get tight." Everyone knew who he was talking about. Tom Miller just kept his head down. The profits from those good years were real, and he was thankful for them. But he didn't see them as a windfall to be spent. He saw them as a buffer. The first thing he did was pay off his operating loan from the previous year. Then he paid off the modest loan he'd taken out for the 7,700. For the first time since his father had passed, he was completely and totally debt-free, save for his property taxes. The feeling was like a weight lifting off his shoulders, a quiet, profound sense of security that was worth more to him than any new tractor. He used the rest of the money to improve the farm he already had. He hired a contractor to install new drainage tile in his wettest 40 acres. A slow, expensive project that wouldn't show any immediate, flashy results, but would pay dividends in crop yields for decades to come. He built one new grain bin, a modest one, but it was enough to let him store all of his corn on farm, so he could wait for better prices after the harvest glut instead of being forced to sell at the elevator. He re-roofed the barn and put a new coat of red paint on it. To his neighbors, his actions were baffling. He was sitting on a gold mine, and he was spending his money on paint and clay pipes buried in the ground. "Tom, what are you doing?" His neighbor to the east, a good man named Frank, asked him one day over the fence. "Land next to you just sold for 2,000 an acre. You could mortgage your place, buy another 200 acres, and have it paid for in 5 years with these prices." Tom just leaned on a fence post and looked out over his fields of dark, healthy corn. His rebuilt 7,700 combine sat in the shed, ready to go. "I'm farming 320 acres, Frank. It's enough to keep me busy. And it's mine, all of it. That's a feeling I'm not in a hurry to give up." Frank just shook his head and walked away, muttering something about old-fashioned fools. Tom was seen as a failure. In an era of explosive growth, he was standing still. His discipline was mistaken for fear. His prudence was seen as a lack of vision. He was a man out of time, a ghost of a farmer from a different generation. The fall of 1975 was a wet one. It rained for a week straight in late October, turning the fields to mud. When it finally cleared, there was a frantic rush to get the crops out before the snow flew. Tom fired up the 7,700. It started on the first try, the engine settling into that familiar, steady rumble. He engaged the separator and the header, and everything ran smooth. He drove into his cornfield, the machine performing flawlessly, just as he knew it would. He was proud of the work he'd done. Across the road, Rich Harrison's operation was a sight to behold. His big Gleaner L2 was running, its powerful lights cutting through the twilight. A fleet of semis was lined up on the road, waiting to be filled and sent to the river terminal. It was a massive, impressive display of capital and logistics. Tom worked his own fields, a solitary figure in his older, smaller machine. He could hear the CB radio chatter from Rich's crew, a cacophony of voices coordinating the massive effort. Late one night, as Tom was making his last round, he saw the lights of Rich's combine stop in the middle of the field. They didn't move for a long time. Then he saw the headlights of a pickup truck bouncing across the corn stubble toward it. He finished his round, shut down his machine, and drove his grain truck back to his bins. As he was climbing down from the cab, he could hear the faint, angry sound of a hammer banging on steel, carrying across the cold night air. The sound of frustration. The sound of a man who didn't know what was wrong and didn't know how to fix it. The next morning, on his way into town for a filter, Tom saw the dealer's service truck parked on the road by Rich's field. The gleaner was still sitting in the same spot, a wounded giant surrounded by a huddle of men. Tom didn't feel any satisfaction. He just felt a quiet sense of unease. A few weeks later, after the harvest was finally over, Tom went to the bank to talk about his operating loan for the next spring. His loan officer was a man named Mr. Abernathy, an older, cautious man who had been his father's banker as well. "Your books are in perfect order, as always, Tom," Abernathy said, peering over his spectacles. "You're one of the few I don't have to worry about." "Just trying to stay afloat," Tom said. Abernathy leaned back in his squeaky chair. "It's a strange time. I've never seen anything like it. Land prices are completely disconnected from the earning potential of the land itself. We're writing loans based on equity that feels like smoke. And the interest rates—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "The Federal Reserve is getting nervous about inflation. They're starting to raise the prime rate. Most of these new loans, these big ones, they're all on variable rates." He looked at Tom pointedly. "A man like Rich Harrison, he's leveraged so high that a 2-point jump in his interest rate would cost him more in a year than you make in 3. He thinks he's a genius, but he's just a gambler who's been on a lucky streak. And the house always has a way of winning in the end." Tom left the bank feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. He drove home, the grey sky pressing down on the flat, empty fields. He looked at his own farmstead. The modest house, the freshly painted barn, the 2 simple grain bins. The old but reliable machinery sitting clean in the shed. It didn't look like much compared to the empire across the road, but it was his. It was real. As he pulled into his lane, he glanced over at Harrison's place. A brand new 4-wheel drive Steiger tractor, the biggest on the market, was being unloaded from a flatbed truck. The boom times were still rolling. But on the horizon, Tom could see the clouds gathering, darker and more menacing than any harvest-time thunderstorm he had ever seen. The late 70s arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, draining hiss, like air leaking from a giant tire. The first sign of trouble was the rain. It simply stopped. The spring of 1977 was dry, the sky a pale, indifferent blue day after day. The soil in the fields turned from rich black loam to a fine grey powder that blew in the relentless May wind. Tom watched his corn struggle to emerge from the cracked earth, the tender green shoots looking thirsty and frail. He cultivated carefully, trying to preserve every drop of moisture, his old Farmall M leaving neat dark lines in the dusty fields. Across the road, Rich Harrison's operation seemed to defy the drought. He had installed 2 massive center-pivot irrigation systems on his flattest sections. Great steel spiders that crawled in endless circles, drawing water from deep wells. The cost was astronomical, another layer of debt, but the corn under the pivots was a shocking vibrant green against the parched landscape. Rich drove his new Steiger 4-wheel drive, pulling a 40-foot field cultivator, working in an air-conditioned cab while listening to an 8-track tape player. He looked invincible, but the drought was only the beginning. The world shifted. The president announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of everyone's prosperity, collapsed almost overnight. It fell from over $3 a bushel to barely $2, and the elevators weren't even keen to buy it at that price. The news hit the coffee shop like a death in the family. Men who had been planning new machine sheds and Florida vacations now sat in silence, staring into their cups. The squeeze began. The price of diesel fuel, driven by another crisis in the Middle East, doubled. Fertilizer prices soared. The cost of everything a farmer needed went up, while the price of everything he sold went down. For Tom, it was a time for tightening the belt. He did his own repairs, nursed his old equipment along, and sold just enough corn to pay his property taxes and buy groceries. His debt-free status was no longer a quirk, it was a shield. The modest grain bins he had built now seemed like the wisest investment he had ever made. He could afford to wait. For Rich Harrison, there was no waiting. The notes on the land, the pivots, the steiger, the gleaner. They came due every month, relentless as the turning of the earth. The interest rates, which had been manageable in the good times, began to creep up. 7% became 9%, 9% became 12%. Every tick upwards was like another turn of a vise. The first real crack in Rich's empire appeared during spring planting the next year. His big Steiger tractor, the symbol of his dominance, went down. It wasn't something simple. A seal in the planetary hub of the front axle failed, a complex repair deep inside the guts of the machine. The dealer's service truck came out, but the young mechanic they sent was intimidated by the sheer scale of the tractor. He spent a day taking it apart, only to realize he didn't have the specialized tools to pull the bearings. They had to order them from the factory in Fargo. For 10 critical days, the biggest tractor in the county sat silent, its massive dual tires looking like monuments to failure. Rich was a storm of fury and frustration, pacing his yard, shouting into the phone at the dealership manager. He had thousands of acres to plant, and his main horse was lame. Meanwhile, Tom was in his fields. His John Deere 4020, now nearly 20 years old, developed a fuel leak from a high-pressure injector line. He saw the telltale clean spot on the dusty engine block, shut it down, and walked back to his shop. He found a spare line he'd salvaged from a junked tractor years ago, bent it carefully to fit, and installed it with 2 wrenches. The whole repair took him less than an hour and cost him nothing but a bit of grease on his knuckles. He was back in the field before the sun was high, the steady, familiar rhythm of the 4020's engine, a comforting sound in the anxious quiet of the countryside. He finished his planting on time, his fields neat and well tended. He was small, but he was moving. Rich was big, and he was stopped dead. By the time Rich's Steiger was running again, he had lost the best window for planting. He rushed, working day and night, pushing his equipment and his hired men to the breaking point. The quality of the work suffered. His rows were uneven, the seed depth inconsistent. It was the kind of mistake a man makes when he's running scared. The change in the community was palpable. The talk about Rich was no longer admiring, it was laced with a kind of grim, fearful speculation. Men would watch his frantic activity from their turn rows and shake their heads. "He's spread too thin," they'd murmur. "A man can't farm that much ground by himself, not properly." The respect he had commanded was evaporating, replaced by pity and a dark sense of foreboding. They saw in his struggle a terrifying reflection of their own vulnerability. The summer of 1981 was hot and unforgiving. The corn in the unirrigated fields grew stunted and pale. Tom's crop was not immune, it suffered like everyone else's. But his costs were low. A poor yield would hurt, but it wouldn't break him. For Rich, with his massive overhead, a poor yield was catastrophic. The corn under his expensive pivots was his only hope, the only crop that looked like it might cover its own costs. One evening in July, a storm built on the western horizon. It wasn't a rainstorm. The sky turned a sickening greenish black. The air grew still and heavy. Tom knew the signs. He rushed to close the big doors on his machine shed just as the first hailstones, the size of marbles, began to fall. Within minutes, they were the size of golf balls, then baseballs, driven by a furious wind. The sound on the tin roof of the shed was a deafening, terrifying roar, like a freight train passing inches overhead. The storm lasted only 15 minutes, but it was enough. When it was over, Tom stepped outside into a world that was shredded and broken. Leaves were stripped from the trees. The vinyl siding on the west side of his house was pockmarked and cracked. He walked out to the edge of his fields. His corn was beaten to a pulp, the stalks broken and bent, the leaves torn to ribbons. A year's work, destroyed in a quarter of an hour. He felt a hollow sickness in his stomach. Then he looked across the road. Rich's corn, the perfect irrigated corn that was supposed to be his salvation, was gone. It had been hit even harder. There was nothing left but a field of mangled pale green stalks. Tom could see the great steel structure of the irrigation pivot, dented and twisted by the massive hailstones. It was a scene of utter devastation. In that moment, Tom knew it wasn't just a crop that had been lost. An empire had just fallen. The farm crisis of the 1980s descended on Black Hawk County like a plague. It wasn't a sudden crash, but a slow, grinding erosion of hope. The prime interest rate, the number that governed every variable rate loan, soared to an unthinkable 21%. Loan officers who had once courted farmers with easy credit now looked at them with cold, unforgiving eyes. The equity that had seemed so real just a few years before had vanished like a morning mist. Land that had been valued at $3,000 an acre was now impossible to sell for half that. Foreclosure auction notices began to appear in the legal section of the newspaper. Small print obituaries for family farms. Green and red machinery, once the pride of generations, sat in muddy farmyards with auction numbers taped to the cabs. The community was gripped by a quiet terror. Farmers avoided each other's eyes at the co-op, ashamed of their own struggles, afraid to ask about their neighbors for fear of the answer. Tom Miller survived. He had no debt, so the terrifying rise in interest rates didn't touch him. His needs were simple. He ate from his wife's large garden, heated his house with wood he cut from his own timber, and bought only what was absolutely necessary. He sold some of his stored corn from the previous year, enough to get by. His farm, which had seemed so small and old-fashioned during the boom, was now a fortress. Its security wasn't in its size, but in its self-sufficiency. Rich Harrison had no such fortress. He was exposed on every front. His operating loans were tied to the prime rate. His equipment payments were immense. His income had been wiped out by the hailstorm. He was trapped. He tried to sell off some of his newer land to raise cash, but there were no buyers. The men who had envied him now looked away when he approached. He had become a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered about in hushed tones. The end came in the spring of 1983. Tom saw the notice in the paper, a full-page ad with a stark black border. Absolute auction, it read. By order of the Agri-Credit Corporation of Omaha, the assets of Harrison Farms. The list went on for 2 columns. The Steiger, the IH-1466, the Gleaner Combine, the rows of silver grain bins, the late model pickups, and at the bottom of the list, the land. Over 3,000 acres to be sold in parcels. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect match for the mood of the crowd. It was held on Rich's farmstead, in the shadow of the giant heated machine shed he had been so proud of. The crowd was different from the one at the Henderson auction a decade earlier. There was no optimism, no swagger. The faces were grim, etched with worry. They were here not just to witness a neighbor's downfall, but to measure their own proximity to the abyss. Tom was there. He hadn't wanted to come, but he felt he had to. He stood at the back, just as he had all those years ago. He saw Rich standing near the auctioneer's truck. He was a changed man. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. He wore a cheap work coat, his shoulders slumped. He looked 10 years older, a king surveying the ruin of his kingdom. The bidding was mercilessly slow. The magnificent machines, bought for soaring prices just a few years before, sold for a fraction of their value. The big Steiger, which had cost Rich over $100,000, was bought by a corporate farm from out of state for 30 cents on the dollar. The Gleaner Combine went for even less. Tom watched as Rich's life's ambition was dismantled, piece by piece, by the clipped, emotionless patter of the auctioneer. When they got to the land, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was the final act. Parcel after parcel was sold off to faceless investors and insurance companies, their agents bidding quietly by phone. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. Lot number 12, the original Harrison home quarter, 160 acres with house, barn, and outbuildings. Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just land, it was Rich's history, his father's legacy. He heard a low opening bid from a man in a suit he didn't recognize. Another man, clearly an investor, raised it. They went back and forth, the price climbing slowly, but still far below what it would have been worth in the good years. Tom saw Rich turn his head away, unable to watch. Tom thought of his own farm, paid for with the sweat of his father and himself. He thought of what it meant to have roots, to belong to a piece of ground. On an impulse he didn't fully understand, he raised his hand. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. "I have a bid from Tom Miller," the crowd murmured. Heads turned. The man in the suit looked over at Tom, annoyed. He raised his bid. Tom raised it back. They were the only two left. The investor was bidding with a cool, detached professionalism. Tom was bidding with his heart pounding in his chest, using the savings he had carefully accumulated over the years, the money that was supposed to be his buffer against disaster. It went back and forth, the price climbing higher than Tom had intended. He glanced at Rich, who was now staring at him, his face a mask of disbelief. The investor finally shook his head and dropped his hand. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a crack that echoed in the silence. "To Tom Miller." The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Tom alone in the quiet farmyard. He walked over to the auctioneer's clerk and wrote the check, his hand shaking slightly. It was the largest check he had ever written in his life. He saw Rich walking toward him, his steps uncertain. He stopped a few feet away. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the history of their rivalry hanging in the cold air between them. "Why, Tom?" Rich finally asked, his voice rough. "Why'd you do it? To rub it in? To finally prove you were right?" Tom shook his head. He looked at the old barn, its paint peeling, the same barn Rich's father had built. "No, Rich, this place, it shouldn't be owned by a life insurance company in Des Moines. It's Harrison land. It needed to be bought by a neighbor." He held out a set of keys, the keys to the house he now owned. "The bank gave me 60 days to take possession. You and your family can stay as long as you need. No rent." Rich stared at the keys, then at Tom's face, searching for the mockery, the triumph he expected to find. He found none. All he saw was a quiet decency. His shoulders began to shake, and for the first time, the man who had been the king of Black Hawk County broke down and wept. Tom didn't buy the Harrison Quarter to be a landlord. A few weeks later, after the dust had settled, he went to see Rich. He found him in the old barn, cleaning out his father's toolbox, a lifetime of tools coated in dust and memories. "I've been thinking, Rich," Tom said, leaning against a stall door. "I'm getting older. I can't keep up with all the work myself anymore. I could use a hand." Rich looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "A hired hand." "Tom, Not just a hired hand," Tom interrupted gently. "A partner, on your home place. We'll farm it together. We'll split the costs and split the profits 50-50. You know that ground better than anyone. And when you get back on your feet, if you still want it, you can buy it back from me. For exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." It was an offer of grace so profound that Rich couldn't speak. He just nodded, the simple gesture sealing a pact that would change both their lives. The news of Tom's actions spread through the county like wildfire. The narrative in the diner changed for good. The men who had once dismissed Tom as an old-fashioned fool now spoke his name with a new kind of reverence. He hadn't just survived, he had shown them a different way to be a farmer. A way based not on leverage and expansion, but on community and character. Frank, the neighbor who had urged Tom to borrow and expand, came over one afternoon, hat in hand, to ask if Tom could help him figure out why the hydraulics on his old case tractor had quit. Tom spent the rest of the day in Frank's shop, his hands covered in grease, helping a neighbor get back on his feet. He became the quiet center of the community, the man people turned to when things broke, whether it was a piece of machinery or their own spirit. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed. Tom and Rich farmed the Harrison place together, a study in contrasts, Tom with his careful, methodical approach, Rich with his deep, intuitive knowledge of the soil he'd grown up on, now tempered with a hard-won humility. They were a good team. Eventually, with a modest loan from Mr. Abernathy at the local bank, Rich bought his home quarter back. One crisp October afternoon, nearly 20 years after the Henderson auction, Tom Miller stood on the ladder of his John Deere 7700 combine, greasing the fittings. The machine was now an antique, its green paint faded almost to white on the top, but it ran as smoothly as the day he had finished rebuilding it. Down below, his grandson, a boy of 12 with Tom's clear blue eyes, was learning how to check the tension on the separator belts. "You see, Daniel," Tom said, his voice carrying easily in the still autumn air. "This machine tells a story. Every farmer in this county thought I was crazy for buying it. They were all buying new, bigger, shinier things." He climbed down from the ladder and ran a hand over the combine's worn sheet metal. "They weren't just buying steel," he continued, looking his grandson in the eye. "They were buying payments. They were buying debt. And when times got hard, the bank owned their combines, the bank owned their tractors, and eventually the bank owned their farms." He gestured out toward the fields, a patchwork of gold and brown stubble under the vast Iowa sky. This is ours, not because we were the biggest or the fanciest, but because we were free. Your great-grandfather taught me that the most important thing a farmer can own isn't his land or his equipment. It's his own signature. If you don't owe it to anyone, you can't lose it. Across the road, he could see Rich Harrison on his own combine, a modest, well-cared-for machine he'd bought used for cash. Rich saw him looking and raised a hand in greeting. Tom raised his hand in return. Tom put an arm around his grandson's shoulders. The boy looked up at the old machine, then at his grandfather's weathered face, and he began to understand. He was inheriting more than just a farm. He was inheriting a legacy of wisdom, a quiet strength forged in hardship, and the simple, profound truth that the richest man in the valley isn't the one with the most acres, but the one who sleeps soundly at night, beholden to no one, master of his own small piece of the earth.